Okay, question. What happens when you add to an already unstable political situation the burden of a foreign war? Answer? Things get a lot crazier. In this video, we're going to look at the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars in France and in the rest of Europe. And we're going to try to look at what the impact of the war was on the radicalization of the French Revolution. There's a lot to do, so let's get going. Okay, for this lesson, you're going to need something to take notes with and one primary source, the declaration of war from the Legislative Assembly. Our story begins with the way that news of the French Revolution spread throughout the rest of the continent of Europe. What you'll see is that the revolution was sometimes received with joy and hope, and other times, not so much. So that's where we're going to begin. For many, news of the revolution was a sign of hope. People clamored to hear stories of the storming of the Bastille and the defiance of the National Assembly. A Swedish poet named Kellgren wrote in response to hearing about the news of July 14, 1789, "Tell me, was there ever anything more sublime in history? Even in Rome or Greece, I wept like a child at the story of the Bastille." Kellgren represented many Europeans' feelings that the revolution would bring about a new order in France and even the rest of the continent. Yet others were skeptical. Edmund Burke, the Irish philosopher and British politician, wrote what would become the most famous statement of opposition to the revolution in 1790. Titled The Reflections on the Revolution in France, Burke denounced the revolution as pure sedition and an example of passions overwhelming people. The book sold over 30,000 copies in 2 years. It was an international bestseller, and it demonstrated that many in Europe were afraid that the revolution would bring chaos and not freedom to the rest of Europe. European governments certainly felt that way. Most governments tried to shut down any news of the revolution in their states. As early as May 1789, the government of the Kingdom of Spain decreed that all news from France was prohibited. The Inquisition began prosecuting those who spoke or shared information about the revolution. Press censorship also appeared in Sweden, where the king banned any French publications from entering the country. Yet the most notable statement of a European government about the revolution came in July 1791, only a few weeks after the attempted flight of the royal family. Leopold II, the Habsburg emperor and the brother of Marie Antoinette, sent a letter to the monarchs of Europe in which he denounced the treatment of his sister and her husband by the revolutionaries in France. In the letter, later called the Padua Circular, the emperor called on, quote, all legitimate monarchs to unite with me, to consult on cooperation and measures to restore the liberty and honor of the Most Christian King and his family, and to limit the dangerous extremes of the French Revolution. This was a heck of a statement. Eventually, it was made public, and for the first time, it provided evidence for those who felt that the monarchs of Europe were plotting against the revolution. Conspiracies only got worse in the coming months. First of all, there were already concerns over the actions of the king's brother, the Count d'Artois. The French government had known that he had been plotting against the revolution for quite a while. The government already uncovered one of his plots in Lyon, where he paid a bunch of refractory priests to actually organize a rebellion. And they knew that many counter-revolutionary nobles were joining Artois in the Rhineland in order to devise a plan to overthrow the revolution. In August 1791, suspicions were heightened when news got out that Artois had met with the Habsburg emperor and the King of Prussia in the city of Pillnitz. Artois formally requested military support from the two most powerful armies on the continent. And upon concluding the meeting, the assembled powers put out a joint statement that was massively important and shook revolutionaries in France. Called the Declaration of Pillnitz, this is what it said. Their Majesties, the Emperor and King of Prussia, having heard the wishes and representations of Monsieur the Count of Artois, jointly declare that they view the situation in which the King of France currently finds himself as a subject of common interest for all of Europe's sovereigns. They hope that this interest can not fail to be recognized by the powers from whom assistance is being requested. Consequently, jointly with their respective majesties, they will use the most efficient means in relation to their strengths to place the King of France in a position to be totally free to consolidate the basis of a monarchical government that shall be as amenable to the rights of sovereigns as it is to the well-being of the French nation. In this case, then, their said majesties, the Emperor and the King of Prussia, are resolved to act quickly, in mutual agreement and with the forces necessary to achieve the proposed and common goal. Meanwhile, they shall issue their troops the necessary orders to prepare them for action. Whew. This statement rattled revolutionaries in France because it seemed pretty clearly to indicate that foreign powers were mobilizing to invade. The stage was set for conflict. What tipped France over the edge were a few other factors, which we're going to take on now. It was at this exact moment, a few months removed from the crisis over the flight of the king, in the midst of Artois' meeting with the Emperor of Austria and the King of Prussia, that news of another crisis reached Paris. On August 22nd, 1791, a huge number of enslaved Africans rose up in the northern province of Saint-Domingue, or colonial Haiti. The insurrection swept the island as rebels began setting fire to sugar fields and attacking the homes of enslavers. The insurrection spread and threw the island into chaos. And at around the same time, many free people of color, many of whom were enslavers themselves, but who had been denied access to the same rights that white colonists had, also banded together and started their own insurrection in the colony's western and southern provinces, attacking white colonists who were largely in control of the colonial assemblies. This was the beginning of the Haitian Revolution, a conflict that would lead to the establishment of the independent country of Haiti. When news of the revolution hit Paris, the National Assembly decided that they must intervene and try to suppress the revolts. The Assembly ordered some 6,000 French troops to be sent to the island initially, the first of what would be a large number of military deployments in more than a decade-long conflict. The crisis in Haiti prompted the National Assembly to take its first foreign military action, and it would prepare the way for more. Other crises also dominated the minds and conversations of members of the Assembly. One of the main ones was the crisis over émigrés. Waves of aristocrats and priests had fled the country in the first 2 years of the Revolution. The question was what the government should do about these people. At first, the decision was to provide them with amnesty, welcome them back freely. This is what the newly established Legislative Assembly did in October 1791, right at the beginning of its initial term. The problem is that most émigrés didn't return. They seemed unconvinced that France was once again safe for them. The National Assembly took this reluctance to return as an indication that émigrés were, after all, counter-revolutionary. They refused to come back to France because they wanted the revolution and the new Legislative Assembly to fail. So, on November 9th, 1791, the Assembly took the next step and declared, quote, that all Frenchmen gathered beyond the kingdom's borders were suspected of conspiracy against the fatherland. They declared that all émigrés must return to France by January 1st, 1792, and if they did not, they would automatically be declared guilty of conspiracy and punished with death. Their property, moreover, would be seized by the state. This was a bold move, and it made concrete the association of émigrés with enemies of the state. Émigrés were not the only people that the Legislative Assembly was concerned about, though. There were also suspects within France, namely refractory priests. Remember that refractory priests were those who refused to take the clerical oath, and in so doing, rejected the Assembly's call to swear their allegiance to the nation and to the National Assembly. In the context of 1791, this too was a major problem. Convinced that refractory priests would simply serve as allies for any invading force, the Assembly decided just a few weeks after their decree on émigrés to issue a decree on refractory priests. In the law of November 29, 1791, the Assembly required that all priests in France once again take an oath to the nation, and those who refused would be considered double refractories, having rejected the oath on 2 separate occasions. And they would not only continue to lose their pensions, but also be regarded as suspects, and thus subjected to official surveillance from the state. They would be denied any access to church or public buildings. The assembly was mobilizing the army and passing measures that were distinguishing potential enemies of the state and enacting laws to punish them. It was at this moment that a group of delegates emerged in the assembly as powerful voices for further action against the enemies of France. Led by Jacques-Pierre Brissot, a journalist and delegate from Bordeaux, the Girondins, named because most of them came from the department of the Gironde, wanted to take aggressive measures to safeguard the new legislative assembly and the new regime. On October 20th, 1791, Brissot made a powerful speech in the assembly in which he suggested that France must declare war against all forces of counter-revolution. The only way to protect France, Brissot argued, was a preemptive strike. At first, most were not ready to move in this direction of all-out war. But where Brissot and the Girondins were able to make some headway was on the topic of the Count of Artois. Everyone knew that he was actively plotting against the revolution, so Brissot began petitioning the assembly and the king to issue some sort of declaration ordering Artois to stop. This caught some momentum, and in December 1791, the assembly agreed to demand that the king issue an ultimatum to two cities, Trier and Mainz, two of the cities where Artois was known to have been residing at the time. The demand was that the electors of these cities refuse to harbor Artois and any French counter-revolutionaries. The penalty was war. It was a win-win for the Girondins. Either the electors complied and the assembly had just taken definitive action against counter-revolutionaries abroad, or they reject the ultimatum and France has a reason for going to war. Interestingly, the king complied with all of these requests. He sent the ultimatum to the electors of Trier and Mainz with his approval. Indeed, when he announced his support of the measure, he was loudly applauded in the assembly by the Girondins and others. The electors of Trier and Mainz, seeing the writing on the wall, quickly complied to the request, and the assembly trumpeted the whole affair as a massive victory. But the Girondins were not satisfied. Now they felt they had momentum to push for the real war that would safeguard the revolution permanently. In the spring of 1792, they began petitioning the king once again, this time to push for war against Austria and Prussia. The king, fascinatingly, was receptive to their ideas. In fact, in early spring, he dismissed his entire ministry and appointed Girondins as all of his new ministers. It seemed a new alliance was born between the monarchy and these now very powerful delegates from the Gironde. Together, they devised a plan to bring France to war, and on March 20th, 1792, the king declared in the halls of the National Assembly that he proposed France declare war on the Habsburg Empire. Though it was not unanimous, the Assembly eventually agreed, and the new regime entered into its first major European conflict. It's important to understand what the justification was for going to war, and for that, we should read the declaration of war itself. So right now I want you to pause the video and read the declaration of war. In it, you'll find out a lot about what the perspectives of the Girondins, mostly, was, and why they thought war could be so valuable for France. This is such a document of the early revolution. Yes, it's a declaration of war and a list of grievances against a foreign enemy, but it's also a document that promotes the values of the revolution in some important ways. Here's what I think is one of the most important statements in the document. Here's what the declaration says. The National Assembly declares that the French nation, true to the principles established in the Constitution not to undertake a war with a view to making conquests, and never to use its forces against the freedom of a people, only takes up arms in order to maintain its liberty and its independence. That the war that it is obliged to support is in no way a war of nation against nation, but the rightful defense of a free people against the unjust aggression of a king. For the Assembly, war was essentially about self-defense, and self-defense not only of the people of France, but really of the ideals of the revolution. The big question you're probably asking yourself right now is, wait, why did the king go along with all of this? Well, there's no better way to find out than by asking the king himself. So we welcome once again the ghost of Louis XVI. Louis, are you there?
That is your majesty, peasant?
Okay, sorry. Your Majesty. Your Majesty, you have to tell us, what was the deal with going to war? I mean, you realize that you declared war on your brother-in-law on behalf of the people who were keeping you under house arrest. I mean, did you understand what you were doing?
Oh, did I? Oh, I didn't realize. What a shock. Come on, you ingrate. How else do you think I was going to get out of the Louvre? I tried disguising myself and running, and, well, you see how that went. I needed some help from outside. Some Austrians to come in and break me and my wife out.
Wait, so the whole thing was a ruse? I mean, you wanted France to lose the war?
Yes, get it? That's how I get out. The Queen and I had been sending letters to the Emperor of Austria and others for months. We needed someone to come in and break us free. And you'd seen what happened to the French army. Officers had been deserting. Half of them were in the Rhineland with my brother drinking Rieslings. There was no way the French were going to stand up to the Austrians and Prussians together.
So you just convinced the Girondins that you were in favor of the war all along. You went along with their plans.
Played them like a fiddle, peasant. All I had to do was wait around for my brother-in-law to come and set us free.
And how'd that work out for you?
I don't have to listen to you anymore. I'm not taking any more of this.
Alright, the ghost of Louis XVI, everyone. Yeah, Louis got his war, but it didn't turn out exactly as he anticipated. In this last section, I want to look at the results of the war. The war didn't start well. The Austrians and Prussians were slow to mobilize, so the French decided to take the initiative and cross the border into enemy territory. Yet even in these initial encounters with small groups of Austrian troops, the poorly led units of French troops and untrained units of the National Guard were soundly defeated. In the first clash with Austrian regulars, most units of the National Guard deserted and fled. Desertion rates in the cavalry, moreover, doubled in the first months of the war, composed as it was by members of the nobility who were uninterested in fighting on behalf of the revolution that most of them kind of hated. In many ways, the ghost of Louis XVI was right. The French army was not ready to go to war. Upon hearing that the war had not started well, the assembly began to get nervous, and thus started to search for scapegoats. Why were the French losing, they wondered. The answer, they determined, was treason. There were simply counter-revolutionaries throughout the army and throughout France who were convincing people not to fight. So the assembly made a few decrees in the spring and summer of 1792. On May 18, 1792, it declared all foreigners living in France to be automatically decreed suspects and thus subject to official surveillance from the state. On May 27th, it decreed that all refractory priests that were denounced by at least 20 active citizens would be immediately deported without trial. On August 26th, it went even further and declared that refractory priests would all simply just be rounded up, jailed, and or deported to a penal colony in French Guiana. Hundreds of priests were rounded up and thrown into prisons throughout France. And yet, despite all of this, the war continued to go poorly. On July 5th, 1792, the Assembly officially declared La patrie est en danger, or the fatherland is in danger. They admitted that they were losing the war and that soon foreign armies would be invading France. They proposed the creation of a citizens' army, calling for volunteers all over the country to come and defend the nation. They placed all these sectional assemblies officially into permanent session and requested their assistance in gathering volunteers for the army. And then on September 2nd, 1792, the worst news of all came. The Austrian army had overtaken Verdun, the last major stronghold before Paris. It was confirmed that the Prussians and Austrians were on their way to Paris and were ready to undertake a siege that would crush the revolution once and for all. When news hit Paris, people panicked. There was a wave of retributive violence, later termed the September Massacres. Parisians raided the prisons that were filled with refractory priests, and also lots of other people who were completely unassociated with any sort of suspicion of counter-revolution. Assuming that they were enemies, they murdered the prisoners in cold blood. 50% of the prison population in Paris was killed, an estimated 1,100 to 1,400 people. It was one of the bloodiest single episodes of the revolution to date. And yet, the war was not over. Right at that moment, in September 1792, the first National Guard units assembled in the wake of the La Patrie en Danger decree were arriving in Paris to defend the city. Tens of thousands showed up, and the story is that the volunteers from the southern city of Marseille were singing a particular song as they entered the city, a song that was eventually titled the Marseillaise. This song, of course, would eventually become the national anthem of France. The huge army of volunteers marched with French regulars to meet the Austrians outside of Paris. They encountered the Austrians at Valmy, about 200 kilometers east of the capital. In what revolutionaries would eventually call the miraculous Battle of Valmy on September 20th, 1792, the French volunteers and regulars managed to stop the advancing Austrian forces and turn them back. The victory was lauded as God saving the revolution. And indeed, had the Austrians won, they would inevitably have moved on the capital and more than likely taken it. Valmy became a turning point of the war. The Austrians and Prussians were in retreat. The French began to pursue them, even across borders. They were led by new national heroes, the generals Dumouriez and Kellermann, nobles who had refused to flee France and instead chose to fight for the new regime. Dumouriez took his troops into Belgium. Kellermann pursued the Germans to Mainz. As they marched, they gained momentum, and by November 1792, the French had actually captured major foreign cities, Mainz, Frankfurt, and even Brussels. As they went, the French army got more experienced, and as they got more experienced, they became more powerful. We're going to pick up on the war more in videos later on, but right now I just want to leave you with one big thing. At this moment, in 1792, we have one more variable to add to the dimensions of the revolution: war. War helped polarize France. It motivated revolutionaries to get even more aggressive against all those they suspected of being a part of the counter-revolution. Refractory priests, émigrés, aristocrats, and others all became targets for these revolutionaries. And all this contributed to the growing radicalization of the revolution, which we'll see in even more depth in the next video. Okay, that's it for now. Good job, good luck, see you soon.